trusts his bishops to make good decisions. He's given us very clear directives to respond as best we can, thoroughly and honestly. We're trying to do that as best we can.
At noon on the first Friday of every month, Arthur Basilice stands outside Philadelphia's cathedral to remind the Archdiocese of its role in the death of his only son.
I know kids die every day, sickness, accident, or whatever. And nobody should have their kid taken away from them by somebody that claims to represent God.
Arthur Basilice's son and hundreds of other children were victims in one of the worst criminal cover-ups in Philadelphia's history.
I was shocked. It was huge. I was shocked because it was so sickening. And I was shocked by how many perpetrators there were.
We got evidence of something that was horrific, a horrific cover-up of, systemic crime over decades.
At some point, somebody should have stopped and said, wait a minute, we have to do something.
The law didn't mean anything to these men, nor to these lawyers. What was primary in their mind was survival.
And you know what? In the end, this is really what takes the cake for me. In the end, after the lawyers and the church people swore that they had given us everything they had in their secret archives, we found out it was a total lie. A total lie.
This is the story of what happened when District Attorney Lynn Abraham heard that the Archdiocese had a list of 35 priests guilty of child sexual abuse and decided to investigate.
Lynn Abraham said, "You've got a list? Where is it? I want to see it." And the story of that list is quite a story.
This is Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. It was founded in 1682 by William Penn, a Quaker who vowed the city would be a place of religious tolerance and freedom.
What a great city. The cradle of liberty, the Liberty Bell, the Declaration of Independence, the birthplace of our country right here, right in Philadelphia. How could you not love the city?
Today, Philadelphia's 1.5 million Catholics represent almost 40% of the city's population. Its archdiocese is one of the largest after Boston's, and both shared the same dark secret for years.
It was 2002. The press was starting to break the stories about Boston.
They had like 80 problem priests, predator priests roaming around, and people started asking, well, if Boston has 80, how many do we have?
In April 2002, Philadelphia's Archbishop, Cardinal Anthony Bevilacqua, and other American cardinals were summoned to Rome for an emergency summit with the Pope. The group later issued a statement apologizing to victims, but failing to promise action against clergy who abused them.
Catholic Church was very eager to argue, and in some sense is still arguing, that the real issue in clergy sexual abuse is a few bad apples. That every institution in society that provides children's services has incidents of child sexual abuse. There are going to be abusers wherever you go. The real problem in the Catholic Church is individual abusers had upwards of 200 or 300 or in one case 800 victims. That's only possible because of the institutional failure.
On his return from Rome, Cardinal Bevilacqua faced the press.
The cardinal said, "We no longer have any suspected abusers, sexual abusers of children, in ministry in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia."
He put out a PR statement that we don't have a problem here. In contrast to how bad things are in Boston, over 40 or 50 years in the Archdiocese, we've only had, and I think his number was like 35 priests with a, sex abuse problem.
When Lynn Abraham heard what he said, she said, well, wait a minute, let's check our files. If he said there was 35 cases, how many did this office handle?
Lynn Abraham, Philadelphia's district attorney, led a team of 600 prosecutors, investigators, and support staff in an office that prosecuted 75,000 criminal cases a year. This case was different. It was the first wide-scale investigation of clergy sexual abuse after Boston's. And it wasn't prompted by an active prosecution, but a hunch.
I got together a group of my investigators and I said, it can't be that there is no sex abuse of children in the whole history of the Roman Catholic Church in Philadelphia, if history and the rest of the world are any indication. And I said, I think it is worth a look and an investigation.
In the criminal justice system, there's quite a bit of record retention. I mean, you want to find out what somebody had done before. So we went back through all the files, and they only found one case.
The police would not arrest a priest if they knew he had done something. They would call the archbishop or the church up and say, come get your guy. Of course, the church never told the police about any of them, but if somebody else did, the police wouldn't even investigate them.
The church had an enormous influence on everybody's life who was Roman Catholic. I mean, your soul. I mean, just the thought that you would challenge the authority of someone who could say you're excommunicated and you're never going to have the sacraments of the church and you're not going to be buried on holy ground and you're not going to receive last rites. That was terrifying.
Thinking was that the church knew best, the church could police its own, and since everybody involved was Catholic, you know, the victims were Catholic, the predators were Catholic, the police were usually all Catholic, it was like a closed society. You know, and Philadelphia is kind of a parochial town, so you had all those factors. I know it doesn't make any sense to an outsider, but that's the way it was.
District Attorney Lynn Abraham's next step was to reach out to Cardinal Bevilacqua.
You just don't stick your thumb in the eye of the church. You go to them, which I thought was appropriate, and say, look, here's what we're doing. We would like your cooperation. Now, we didn't meet with the Cardinal. The Cardinal didn't want to meet with us. We met with his lawyers.
I mean, there was successive meetings, and finally she said to him, I am the chief enforcement officer, law enforcement officer in this area. I have a responsibility. If you're aware crimes happen here, I need to know from you what happened. And they said, well, we're not telling you.
I said, look, you can resist me all you want. I'm going to subpoena you. I'm going to drag you into court every day, and you're going to have to tell a judge why you won't release files of people whom you know have sexually abused little children. You have to tell me that. You have to tell the judge that. And we're going to let the judge decide.
Stonewalled by the Archdiocese, Lynn Abraham and her team set out to find a legal premise to persuade a judge to call a grand jury.
The name of the game here is getting information that other institutions in society, whether it's the press or the criminal justice system, has not been able to get out.
The detectives were tracking child pornography being delivered to the convents, to the rectories, and they seized the stuff, brought it to a judge, showed the judge child pornography, said this stuff is being received by priests at the rectories.
The judge was so upset by what she saw that she approved the application for a grand jury. Now the Archdiocese challenged the court on constitutional grounds.
They claimed, violation of church and state, and we had a very good judge who ruled correctly that said, no, this is an investigation of a crime. It's not an investigation of an organization.
We have to quit following this taboo that you can't say anything negative about religion. Let's just call abuse for what it is. It's abuse.
The court's decision was a body blow for the Archdiocese. It meant that its secret archives would be open to scrutiny by civil authorities for the first time.
The Catholic Church is probably the most highly bureaucratized religion in the United States, maybe in the world, with a very advanced and sophisticated system of record keeping and hierarchical control. And the result of that is that when there has been sexual abuse that occurs, it's often documented and it's often dealt with under the authority of a fairly well-organized administrative system.
The God Squad, as the team came to be known, pressed their advantage. Only now they ran up against canon law, the church's legal system.
Many religious institutions have theological rules that forbid publication or letting out of the religious group any bad news or any criminal behavior by those inside. So there's what's called in the Catholic Church the rule against scandal. It is a rule. It's a canon law. You are not allowed to tell outsiders about the behavior of priests with animals, children, or other men at risk of excommunication.
Did we get documents from them? Yes, we got documents from them. Did we have to fight for everything that we got? Yes. It was a fight.
They tried to strike a deal with us that we wouldn't use it for prosecution. They sent us paperwork that said we'll only go so far and no further. And we said, oh no. So the more they tried to make deals with us, the more suspicious we began to think that this is big. This is really big. So what we started out with something that might have been relatively small got bigger because they started to push back very, very, very aggressively.
During the investigation, 30 subpoenas were issued. The Archdiocese was ordered to hand over 45,000 documents.
We had a file room that was maybe 20 by 15 with file and boxes stacked. We had 200 boxes of stuff that we went through.
I remember just like opening up the boxes. I'm like reading this, and you would put one file down, and then you read the next one. And it was like, oh my God. It was like being in some sort of like weird library devoted to sex crimes.
The sordid content of the archives was only one reason the U.S. Council of Bishops advised dioceses to find ways to protect archives from civil discovery. In Philadelphia, the Archdiocese divided personnel files into three. Those that contained sexual abuse allegations were kept separately.
There was a secret archive room where they kept filing cabinets, where they kept all these files, okay? And that was in an office where the Secretary of Clergy was, and it was apparently down the hall from where Cardinal Bevilacqua was.
The secret archives were secret even within the Archdiocese. Only the Archbishop and some of his managers had access to them. It was left to prosecutors to analyze what they contained, and soon, patterns began to emerge.
We'd get the archives file, read about the various complaints that were against him, and then you would go and see his history of his appointments. All these guys, none of them stayed more than 5 years.
The names of those who complained of abuse were in the files, but Lynn Abraham and her team suspected there were many more victims and set out to find them.
We made an announcement that we were going to conduct a grand jury looking into clergy sex abuse, specifically in the Roman Catholic Church. But we would take any kind of complaint from anybody. We didn't care if they were Orthodox Jews or Jehovah's Witness, or we didn't care who they were. But all of the complaints were about Roman Catholic priests who had abused these people for long periods of time and over decades.
So we were talking to guys late 20s all the way up into their 70s, and they all had, kind of similar personal profiles, so to speak, in the time after they were abused. So you'd have a lot of divorces, they couldn't maintain a relationship, alcoholism, failure to maintain a job, drug abuse.
All these victims walk around with guilt because they think it was something they did to cause this. You were a child, I keep telling them. You're an adult now, but you were a child then. He was an adult, he knew what he was doing, and he knew that it was wrong, and he went ahead and did it anyway. And in that situation, you have every right, and with your own courage, to tell us what happened.
The grown man would be bawling his eyes out and, sort of talking about how his life had been ruined and stuff. So, my response was I would cry a lot of times too, and then I'd go home and I'd drink a lot of whiskey.
There are seldom witnesses to the sexual abuse of children, but prosecutors needed evidence to corroborate alleged victims' testimony.
It's not that we didn't believe them, it's just we had no other independent proof of what they were saying, who was at what church, at what time, doing what role, who he worked under.
We would go out to a particular parish and ask questions about a priest that had allegations against him. We would interview the priest that had lived with him and had served with him during the time that he was alleged to have, abused a child, and they would say, some of them would say, yeah, we always thought that there was something funny about Father X.
Prosecutors began by interviewing the pastors of parishes, spiritual leaders of a community, administrators with special responsibility for the welfare and Catholic education of minors, and obliged to follow orders from their archbishop, whether they agreed with them or not.
He wins. There was certainly a culture in Philadelphia that if the archdiocese was sending a priest somewhere, well, then the pastor and the other priests in the house were to accept that. When resistance was offered, that didn't go well.
Some of them did report their concerns. Like if you look through the archives, there are actual cases where priests said, this guy's acting in a weird way with kids, But some of them didn't, and when we asked why didn't you, they just said, you just didn't do that.
I think the priesthood is like any other closed society, that we create a culture amongst ourselves, sometimes a language amongst ourselves, jokes amongst ourselves, ritual amongst ourselves, and certainly not just in the priesthood in general, but the priesthood in Philadelphia, because we all, for the most part, have attended the same seminary. So you come to grow up with each other. And so those relationships last a long time. But a culture of brotherhood, and in some sense, brotherhood at all costs.
During the investigation, prosecutors hit a wall of silence. They needed help from an insider, and someone told them about Monsignor James E. Malloy, who worked at the heart of the Archdiocese between 1988 and 1994.
He was known as the Vicar for Administration for Cardinal Bevilacqua. So his job essentially was to handle these allegations of child sex abuse as they came in.
Prosecutors traveled to Sellersville, a small town 45 miles northwest of Philadelphia, where Monsignor Malloy was now the pastor of St. Agnes.
Knocked on the door, he says, yeah, come on in. I said, well, Father, we want to talk to you about, your job. He says, yeah, I understand. I said, well, you don't want an archdiocesan lawyer? He said, no, I don't want a lawyer here. He says, I'm going to tell you what happened.
He was the only one in the sort of inner circle of the administration that actually sat down and talked to us without a lawyer, cooperated with us. Everybody else in the hierarchy of the church refused to talk to us.
He was a good man. I mean, he sat there and he told us, he said, I knew these people were predators. I knew how bad they were. And they kept telling me to do this and do that, and I decided I wasn't going to do it anymore.
Monsignor Malloy was able to give the DA's team details about the Archdiocese's procedures for handling allegations of abuse.
He was extremely precise. He was very organized. He was very detailed. Like, he was one of the ones, there were like maybe 5 to 10 priests over the time period that we looked at who would take notes whenever a family came in to make an allegation of sexual abuse, because they would interview the parents and they would interview the kid and so on and so forth. And I remember his note-taking as being, stood out from the other priests as being, detailed.
The information Monsignor Malloy provided helped prosecutors, but they were up against Cardinal Bevilacqua, a qualified civil and canon lawyer, and a reluctant witness when he appeared before the grand jury.
The first 2 days, he said, I don't recall, 90 times, okay? 90 times. 90 times he doesn't recall. He's a man that's running an institution, a corporation, a community of faith, and these horrendous crimes are happening, and he doesn't recall.
I can't believe that any bishop or any cardinal, archbishop, would not know what's going on. It just doesn't work that way.
After 2 years of investigations, trawling through thousands of documents and interviewing dozens of alleged abusers and their victims, the grand jury's report was released. It criticized the Archdiocese's procedures, its failure to report cases to civil authorities, and it challenged the Archbishop's claim that there were no more than 35 priests credibly guilty of child sexual abuse in the past 50 years.
We received files on 169 with allegations, and I think, we knew there was a lot more there. We knew there were still people in the priesthood who had been accused, and maybe in my mind, maybe credibly accused. And so it was, for a long time, it was hard to just sort of sit on that information.
The grand jury only lasts for 18 months with the right of the court to grant you another 6 months. And we hadn't finished our work after 2 years, so we had to impanel a second grand jury to begin where the other grand jury left off. That second grand jury had to be told everything that happened, line by line, word by word, in the first grand jury.
They read the documents that they have. They just read everything. Then they started to bring in victims and witnesses, priests. We even brought in experts to give us, so we would have knowledge. They wanted us to know what a pedophile was. They didn't just want us to randomly figure out what was going on. They gave us a wealth of information, so we knew what we were looking at.
John Salverson is the president of the Foundation to Abolish Child Sexual Abuse. He became an advocate for victims after he was abused by a Catholic priest, abuse that began while he was a student and went on for 7 years.
I don't think I could have been abused by, almost anybody but a priest. That was, it never, ever occurred to me from the first day of the abuse to tell someone or to do something about it because he was a priest.
Prosecutors asked John Salverson for his help to support other victims who testified, and they asked him to tell his own story.
We were educating the people in the prosecutor's office. We were also educating the grand jurors, and I was early in that process. That was a long grand jury, and there were people, as I was talking, who were visibly upset in that grand jury pool. They couldn't believe the things I was telling them.
When you're listening to these grown people talk about this, and you're seeing these grown men cry. I mean, there was a lot of days that you just watch the panel, and we have tears just coming down because we're sympathizing with these victims.
I've been, in and out of therapy over 35 years and dealing with the trauma, this issue, etc. And what I want, I can't get. I want to be the person I was the day before I was abused by a priest. And that's just never going to happen.
I can't imagine that an adult would do that to a child, and let alone a priest, somebody that this child is having such high esteem. Because the victims that we talked to, that in addition to being molested, they couldn't get over the fact it was the priest. And some of the cases stand out to me. I will never forget.
One of those cases was that of a girl called Ruth. Father Nicholas Cademo sexually assaulted Ruth for the first time when she was 10 years old. The next year, he began raping her. Afterward, he would hear her confession. Then Ruth became pregnant. Catholic doctrine forbids abortion, but that didn't stop Father Cademo from organizing the termination of the pregnancy, nor escalating Ruth's abuse.
She goes in this room, and there are several priests in this room, and she realizes immediately what's going on. She tries to run. She turns around and tries to run out the room. They dragged her back by her feet. Imagine a 13, 14-year-old girl being dragged back by priests and raped by every one of them. And in the Catholic Church, you don't say, when you find out that victim, you don't go and offer her help. You got to. How can these people wear the collar?
Despite a number of allegations against Father Cademo, Cardinal Bevilacqua promoted him as pastor to Philadelphia parishes not once, but twice. Jurors heard that Father Cademo was only removed after a number of victims threatened to name the Archbishop in a lawsuit. Afterward, the Archdiocese issued a certificate stating that Father Cademo was a retired priest in good standing and able to serve in any parish in the country.
There were a lot of Catholics within our group who had no idea that this was even going on. So for them to hear it, and then they wanted an explanation. They wanted a reason. Tell us why. Tell us why this happened. Give us a reason. Give us something.
Though Cardinal Bevilacqua appeared before the grand jury 10 times, he failed to give jurors the answers they were after.
For him to expect that those people were going to believe that he didn't remember this stuff? You don't remember. I mean, you know, the most egregious thing that happened under your supervision, these children being destroyed, you don't remember that?
Cardinal Bevilacqua testified for the last time on the 6th of February 2004. He continued to deny knowing details of allegations, saying that he relied on his managers to deal with them. The investigators now returned to questioning his right-hand man, Monsignor William J. Lynn, Secretary for Clergy. He supervised and transferred priests around the Archdiocese, and he sent priests accused of misconduct for treatment.
Meaning a wholly owned, a psychological treatment center that was wholly owned by the Archdiocese. So, in our opinion, there was no chance that they were going to get an independent, you know, sort of reputable opinion about the danger of that particular priest.
Monsignor Lynn confirmed that he had no qualifications or training in psychology or psychiatry. Yet he repeatedly reassigned abuser clergy against the advice of experts who warned that they were likely to abuse again.
Because we know that pedophiles don't stop with one child. They move on to the next child. And if the FBI is correct, many of them have typically over 100 victims over the course of a lifetime. And even more horrifically, they don't stop abusing in their 40s or their 50s. They abuse in their 60s, 70s, and 80s.
By the time Cardinal Bevilacqua and Monsignor Lynn were dealing with these issues, they knew the science said these people would do it again. They weren't going to be rehabilitated. They weren't just going to go confess and feel bad and stop doing it.
Despite the Cardinal's claim that he didn't know details of allegations, Monsignor Lynn testified that the Cardinal was aware. 10 years earlier, he sent him a list of priests he believed to be credibly guilty of abuse.
And there was discussions about this list, and that's why we kept asking him about it. And Lynn knew that it existed, okay? And they just continued to hide it.
Prosecutors had found proof that the list existed, but not the list itself.
For some reason, he'd written in a document in another priest's file about this list of 35 priests, and so it was very specific.
In a memo, Monsignor Lynn wrote, "Father Beazle and I reviewed the 323 files that are presently stored in the secret archives. Attached is a list of priests who've been guilty of or accused of sexual misconduct with a minor."
He'd gone through and he'd made it at a certain point of time, and he spent a lot of time on that list. So he knew what list we were asking for, and, you know, so he just had to say, "I'll go look for it."
Monsignor Lynn testified that he couldn't recall making the list, who was on it, or what happened to it. By April 2004, when the grand jury hearings ended, the list which started the investigation was still missing, and Lynn Abraham and her team suspected it wasn't the only document they hadn't received.
It was tough, it was brutal, it was very long searching and to get what we wanted. And you know what, in the end, this is really what takes the cake for me. In the end, after the lawyers and the church people swore that they had given us everything they had in their secret archives, we found out it was a total lie. A total lie.
Over the next year, prosecutors pored over the evidence they had gathered and considered the legal options to bring the guilty to justice.
We got evidence of something that was horrific, a horrific cover-up of, you know, systemic crime over decades.
You know, you wonder why has been going on for so long and it took a while, is because nobody wants to face such a horrendous crime. Nobody wants to believe that that happened. Nobody wants to believe that the guys that are running your church or that are running your Boy Scout troop would do something like this. But these men are out there, okay? And it's my job as a prosecutor and as someone that does work to hopefully protect the community. It's our job, if the truth is there, to expose it.
The grand jury's findings were devastating. Many felt that the image of the city of brotherly love had been tarnished by its most influential institution, the Catholic Archdiocese.
What we're talking about is child rape. Children as young as 10 or 11 years of age, both boys and girls, were forcefully, illegally penetrated by grown clergymen. Our children were used as masturbation tools or for disgusting acts of sexual sadomasochism.
I was shocked. It was huge. I was shocked because it was so sickening. And yeah, I was shocked by how many perpetrators there were. I was shocked by how long it had gone on and by how many people knew about it and didn't do anything.
I am deeply saddened to say, wounded to acknowledge, that the evidence is clear that this reaches the top, the very top of our archdiocese.
I was stunned. When the 2005 grand jury report came out, I looked at it through my own lens because I knew one of the priests, beyond the shadow of a doubt. It affected me and many others that I know. For me now, I have very little faith in the institutional church.
It is almost unthinkable that anyone learning of such abuse would let it continue. But that's just what the leaders of the Philadelphia Archdiocese did. They were confronted time and again with parishioners' complaints, and sometimes even admissions by clergy themselves that they had indeed forcibly sexually assaulted children. But they chose not to stop it because they didn't want the scandal. They didn't want to, quote, hurt the church's good name, end quote.
Archbishops over 40 years had orchestrated a successful cover-up that kept 63 abuser priests out of jail who had raped and molested hundreds of innocent children.
The 2005 grand jury report was widely regarded as a comprehensive account of clergy sexual abuse and cover-up. It set a benchmark for investigations of its kind.
Archdiocese went nuts. They accused me of being, anti-Catholic. Well, that's going to help. Oh, she's anti-Catholic.
Huge number of the detectives and prosecutors that were investigating this case were Catholics, and not just Catholics in sort of philosophically. They were Catholics that went to mass like at least once a week, if not more.
We were given the facts, their facts. We got the secret archives from their records. Everything we heard from their victims. So for them to say that we were biased, that's just not fair and it's not right.
The report was denounced by Cardinal Regali, who succeeded Cardinal Bevilacqua as Archbishop.
So there on the front page of the local paper is a great big black headline. Cardinal says don't read the report. Well, of course, when the Cardinal said don't read the report, everybody read the report.
We expected them to be humble enough to say, we made a mistake. We messed up here. But they didn't do that. They kind of still wanted to protect them, themselves, rather than the kids still were not a problem for them. So what, these kids are hurting, we have to protect ourselves.
I always thought the church thought this was a moral issue. I always thought that that's why everything they did made no sense to me. I mean, why would they do all these things? This is a moral issue. And when I realized that they didn't treat it as a moral issue, they treated it as a risk management issue, then everything they do makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. But through the lens of morality, it makes no sense.
You hold your faith to a higher level of behavior. And I feel that my Catholic Church, the institution, has completely failed in that. And not only have they not met society's standard, they've fallen beneath it.
The Archdiocese released a 70-page response on the same day. It described the grand jury report as lurid, reckless rhetoric, unfair and inaccurate. District Attorney Lynn Abraham hit back.
Rather than deal with the substance of this report, the church leaders attacked the grand jury process. If they think that we have falsified one thing, release the documents to the public. Let the press and the public review them in their entirety, not through the filter of us or anybody else.
Lynn Abraham had taken the unprecedented decision to publish the names of 63 of the 171 clergy who were identified as credibly guilty, along with details of some of the acts of depravity they committed.
I was the gatekeeper, okay? I was the one that decided which priest's name went into that report. And the only priests that are in that report are priests who we could have gone into trial and prosecuted and presented overwhelming evidence of their guilt.
It was important for victims and for society to get out the names of predator priests who had sexually abused young boys and young girls. I think the courts were very sensitive to the fact that this had to come out.
There isn't one priest named in the 2005 report that has come forward and said or proven that what we put in that report isn't correct. Not one.
This revelation of Catholic clergy abuse within the church must have devastated all those priests who never engaged in sexual abuse of little children. It had to be a horrible, as it is on any person of any faith, when you find that some of your own, whom you believed in and trusted, did something terrible.
It didn't rock my faith. I continued to believe in God, and I continued to believe that God wanted me to be a priest, but it certainly was difficult at times. Could I be a priest here in Philadelphia when I didn't feel like the answers that needed to be given were being given?
We're supposed to be a light on the mountaintop. That's what the gospel says. And we, the Catholic Church, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church didn't do what the gospel mandated them to do: protect the children.
2 grand juries had exposed the failings of the Philadelphia Archdiocese, but it also revealed that law enforcement and other agencies did not fulfill their duty of care to society's most vulnerable. And despite evidence Lynn Abraham had uncovered, the justice system would fail children too.
Regrettably, the perpetrators of these crimes and the people who protected them will never face the criminal penalties that they deserve. That is not because the grand jurors didn't want to file charges and have us arrest and prosecute them. It is because we couldn't do so, primarily because of the statute of limitations in Pennsylvania.
The statute of limitations had expired on every case the grand jury investigated. Victims were denied justice, while abuser clergy and the institution that protected them were off the hook.
People were blown away by it, and there was a lot of righteous indignation that someone should go down for this.
We wanted something to happen. Imagine us sitting there for 2 years hearing all these horror stories, to happen to these children, and you'd be like, okay, they're guilty, what's going to be done? Because if a child was raped by a man on the street, they go to the police, there's a prosecution, that person goes to jail. It seems like the Catholic Church had their own little world.
Did I want to prosecute the cardinal? You bet. Did I want to prosecute Lynn and everybody else in the church hierarchy? I certainly did. But if you don't have the law on your side, as I saw it, and if you don't have victims who fall within the relevant statute of limitations, you couldn't do it.
There's no question about this. This is a crime. Regardless of how the statutes are written in Pennsylvania or any other state, this is a crime to cover up sexual abuse of children and then take those predators and move them to another location and have them do it over and over again.
After the revelations of what has happened in sickening detail in these reports, a lingering question remains. Has anything changed?
The Archdiocese did take steps to improve its handling of allegations against members of its ministry, but there was also evidence that some things remained the same.
There was this other case that was hanging around that we got more information from the Archdiocese on, and I started looking at it, and I opened a completely new grand jury. I handled this one myself.
Franciscan Father Charles Newman was the president of Cardinal Ryan, the Archdiocese's largest high school. In 1992, he befriended a new student called Arthur Basilice.
He would call my home, and he would say, I have a little job at the friary, was wondering if Arthur wanted to do some painting. So through the years, everything seemed okay. And we kind of felt like, gee, you know, how great that this man really took an interest in our kid. Like, how great is that? You know, what a mentor for Arthur. I mean, doesn't get any better than that.
But Arthur's father, a former narcotics detective, became concerned about the amount of time Father Newman was spending with his son.
And I had asked him, what's your relationship with my son? And he would never answer me. And because of the way I was raised as a Catholic, I couldn't confront him or pressure him the way I would if I seen something on the street. I was called on a job and I witnessed something, and I would interview a suspect.
Well, we finally found out what had happened to Arthur from Arthur.
Father Newman and a colleague were giving Arthur drugs and alcohol in order to abuse him. In 2002, the Basilices were unaware that the Archdiocese was investigating him, not for abusing Arthur, but for fraud.
Reverend Charles Newman, Franciscan president of Archbishop Ryan High School, he stole $900,000, $400,000 from the Archdiocese and $500,000, round figures, from his own order while he was president of the school. And he was using that money to pay kids that he was violating, among other things.
Kids.
And Arthur's son was one of the prime victims there.
Before Arthur could report Father Newman, he received a call from an investigator representing the Archdiocese. He advised the Basilices to contact his bosses, who knew Arthur had been abused, and would pay for his treatment.
We made arrangements to bring him to the Archdiocese and make a complaint.
This kid woke up, he's home, sick. He's sick. He's sick because he doesn't have the drug in him, or he needs the drug.
Massive weight loss.
Toothpick. And I said to my husband, that's it. Tell him to get dressed. We're going to Philadelphia now. We're bringing him to the Archdiocesan's office just like this today. And that's what we did.
Members of the Archdiocese Victim Assistance Team listened as Arthur told his story, but then denied liability.
We can't do nothing for you because he's not a Roman Catholic Archdiocesan priest. You got to get in touch with his provincial minister. So at that time, we were so distraught. It was like we got run over by a truck.
But not too distraught to give up. The Basilices contacted the Franciscans, Father Newman's religious order.
I told them, I said, look, I'm not interested in anything else other than getting my son restored to what he was. You broke him, you fix him. That's the way I told him. And that's when more troubles began.
Arthur attended rehab, but returned home before he completed his treatment. Soon after, he received a phone call from the Franciscans.
He walks over to me, puts the phone near my ear, says something to the priest, and the priest says, listen, I am willing to write you a check for $50,000. With that money, you sign that paper, and with that money, you can go anywhere you want or do with it whatever you want. I heard that with my own ears.
I said, that's it. Hang up on that creep. we're going to get an attorney.
Right.
The Basilices filed a private lawsuit against Father Newman. Arthur's testimony and the checks he was given to pay for drugs were presented in evidence. But the court was obliged to dismiss the case, along with Arthur's appeal.
And that comes down to the statute of limitations. He did the crimes, the thieving within the statute of limitations, okay? But he was, when he abused Arthur, it was years before that.
During the grand jury, Father Newman admitted committing fraud and would be charged. In June 2006, a jury found him guilty and sentenced him to 3 to 6 years in prison. But the news came too late for Arthur and his family.
He looked great. He looked great, and one of my brothers got him a job with him at a granite company that he had been working for. And he had the truck. He was able to go back and forth to work in the city. And he had to do meetings. You know, he still had to do that. And then one night he just didn't come home.
Police received a phone call telling them to go to an address in Camden, New Jersey. There they found the body of Arthur Basilice Jr. He had died from a drug overdose, aged 28. Father Newman served his sentence, and it is claimed he is now living a life of penance and prayer. Meanwhile, the Basilices say they will never have any peace and will continue their fight for justice.
Am I doing it for my son? Absolutely. But in doing it for my son, I'm going to pave the way for everybody else.
The design of Pennsylvania's State House was inspired by St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Its dome soars above the city of Harrisburg, the heart of the state's politics. And it was where District Attorney Lynn Abraham turned after the release of the grand jury report.
Roman Catholics who were in the legislature didn't want to believe, as I didn't want to believe, that this was so widespread, so deep, and so ingrained in our priesthood as our sex abuse investigation discovered.
It seems to me a no-brainer that you're going to increase safety for children and make it harder for the pedophiles to succeed. But there are groups that are adamantly opposed to either lengthening the statute of limitations or eliminating them. And the most active group that has sunk the most money into it would be the Roman Catholic bishops in each state.
Historically, the church had the most powerful lobby in Harrisburg. And so, you know, and there's a lot of Catholic legislators, so basically they just bent them to their will.
There were some legislators prepared to fight for reforms which would get victims justice and shift the cost of abuse to those who made it happen. Representative Mark Rotzi was one of them. He had first-hand knowledge of clergy abuse. He was raped by a Catholic priest when he was 12 and didn't tell anyone for 26 years.
I've forgiven my perpetrator, but I can never forgive the diocese because they knew about it. They were moving this guy around all over the place, you know, and then bringing him to my school so he can rape me and abuse a ton of other boys. Bullshit. You know, that's not acceptable. You need to be held accountable. And, you know, they say, well, you know, why you have to go through the civil courts for this? Well, because we can't do anything criminally. Because, you know, the United States Supreme Court said retroactive criminal suits are illegal, but civil suits are fine. So the only way that we can go after them is through the civil courts. And sometimes that's the only thing they understand is when they have to pay.
It's estimated that the Roman Catholic Church in America has so far paid out nearly $4 billion in compensation to victims of clergy sexual abuse.
This has been an expensive way to reform the Catholic Church. But if I said to you, there's a social institution that involves 80 million people in the United States, and it has documented in its own records upwards of 10,000 victims of child sexual abuse perpetrated by somewhere in the ballpark of 5,000 individuals working for that institution, and that some of those individuals had upwards of 200 or 300 victims, you would say to me, that's one of the largest social crises in America in the last century, and I don't care what it costs to clean up.
But there was an industry that did care. because it was liable for those costs.
We have insurance companies lobbying against it in league with the religious organizations because they don't want to have to pay.
And a change in the statute of limitations retroactively is a change in the risk that these companies are insuring after they have made their calculations and after they have relied on things that they thought were pretty reliable. You can imagine what the price tag might be on 9 or 10 children who've been abused over the course of a long period, beknown to the local bishop. We're talking millions of dollars. We're talking millions of dollars that nobody, either in the church or more relevantly, in the liability carrier, an insurance company, ever contemplated.
The reformers were not only up against the Catholic Church and other institutions lobbying against changes in the law, they were also in a face-off with big business. But a year after Lynn Abraham headed to Harrisburg, legislators voted to extend the criminal statute of limitations from 30 to 50 years, and extended the law's reach to hold accountable those who covered up abuse.
The day that we had the statute of limitations legislation passed and signed by Governor Rendell, November the 30th, 2007, was the day that young Arthur overdosed on drugs. Seemed somewhat telling.
Lynn Abraham left office in January 2010. If the grand jury investigation she spearheaded weren't able to bring any prosecutions at the time, they would now.
There were new allegations. After I left office, a couple of people, young men, came forward and made allegations against certain priests that they had been molested within the statute of limitations.
The DA's office was still holding those documents from the first grand jury, and we went back and referred to the documents from the first grand jury to the extent that they showed that Monsignor Lynn had a pattern of not dealing with the predator priests.
And so the present district attorney decided to prosecute Monsignor Lynn, because as the secretary for the clergy and as the right-hand man of the then Cardinal Bevilacqua, he was the one who was in charge of investigating child abuse allegations.
It was just like the lowest level guy. If you were going to string up people in the archdiocese, it'd be, months before you got to Monsignor Lynn, because there were so many bishops that, and priests that needed to be hung.
Cardinal Bevilacqua, now aged 88, was ordered to testify at Monsignor Lynn's trial, but died the night before he was due to appear in court.
So he went from the biggest problem that the archdiocese had. The moment he died, he then became the solution to all their problems. Because the defense in the Lynn case, everybody stood up and said Bevilacqua did it.
12 days after the cardinal's death, the archdiocese released Monsignor Lynn's list of abuser priests. His list, the court was told, was discovered in a locked safe in archdiocese headquarters.
To me, it was a total smoking gun. Monsignor Lynn said he took it to a meeting, and Cardinal Bevilacqua whisked it away and he never saw it again. Well, I don't believe that's the case.
Other documents belonging to Monsignor Lynn were also found in the safe. More evidence that could have helped prosecutors get to the truth 10 years sooner.
So even though we had subpoenas for all the evidence, and even though the archdiocese and their lawyers swore that they had given us everything, that was an absolute falsehood. They hadn't given us everything. They hid, willfully, deliberately hid thousands of pages of documents from us. So we couldn't even find out even more dirty secrets of the church.
The archdiocese lawyers claimed the list was proof that Monsignor Lynn tried to do something about abuser clergy. But it was too late to ask the one person who would know the truth. Monsignor Malloy died 6 years before, but in 1994, he wrote a note on a memo from Cardinal Bevilacqua. It read, "I shredded in the presence of Reverend Joseph R. Sistone 4 copies of the lists from the secret archives. This action was taken on the basis of a directive I received from Cardinal Bevilacqua."
he told me many, many times that documents had not been shredded, and that everything that he was giving us was everything that there was. And so when that letter that came out, I thought, wow, I wonder if Monsignor Malloy wasn't completely straight with me.
They swore they would be loyal to the church and their bishop, and they did that. They did that, no matter what.
On the 22nd of June 2013, Monsignor Lin was sentenced to serve 3 to 6 years in prison. He became the first senior church official to be convicted in connection with the clergy sexual abuse scandal.
And the one guy who goes to jail never touched a kid, and, just was not responsible in any meaningful way for how the church conducted itself. I mean, was he a part of it? Sure. Did he carry out, did he care about, the wishes of the hierarchy more than the kids? The evidence is sadly there that he was worried about people getting big checks or this stuff hitting the press. That was more important to him, sadly.
There's no other way to sugarcoat it. They concealed it. They hid it because it was going to cause what has happened in the church. The church is falling apart. My church that I raised my children in is slowly dying a slow death in the United States and throughout the world.
Moving priests and not making just settlements with families and not being honest with parish communities didn't help the church. Now we're dealing with the backlash of the number of people who have left the church, or young people who just see us lacking integrity and may never come back to church.
This has never been about the church for us. This has been about pedophiles and people who cover them up. And it just so happens to be the church was, wrote the book on the cover-up.
I think it's pretty clear the hierarchy is learned nothing over the last decade. They are continuing to cover up child sex abuse. That's just a fact. And they seem incapable of changing.
I thought that bringing these horrible allegations to light, exposing them to the fresh air, letting everybody know that this great church is built on a foundation that's crumbling underneath it. Maybe they'll take some time to change things. Maybe they'll recognize that these victims are truly victims. They're not making it up. They're not going after the church. It's the church that is victimized then.
In some ways, we should get over this wanting to go back and blame. The church is happy to assume its responsibility, but I'm really quite tired of people making unjust accusations.